And we'll put John out.
See? That's why she does what she does, and I don't.
What, you wouldn't want to write a book like that? You make movies. I just write books. My name is Dr. Marianne Meye Thompson, and I'm the George Eldon Ladd Professor of New Testament. I'm going to be talking today about the Gospel of John. It's a very interesting thing, I think, that Jesus is called the Word of God, because if you think about what a word is, it's something that expresses who we are in a way that nothing else does. So that when we speak, when the words come out, they are revelatory of who we are. They tell other people what we like, what we think, what we believe, what we hold dear. They express our very inner selves. So if there were one word that Jesus speaks, shows us, that tells us what God is, what this Word of God is, I think that one word would be this: life. That God is the life of all the world, and that God gives life to all. So think of the opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. You will probably recognize an echo there of the book of Genesis, because Genesis begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the first book of the Bible, Genesis, starts with creation. Well, the beginning of the Gospel of John starts with creation as well. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This one was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. So when John thinks about the beginning and the beginning of the story he wants to tell, he not only calls to mind the book of Genesis with the creation of the world, but he just flat out says, this is about life, the life that comes from God and is embodied in the person of Jesus. There are a number of stories in the Gospel of John, which we sometimes today call the miracle stories. But that's not John's word, because there actually is no Greek word for miracle. The word that John uses is the word signs. And I think that's an important and interesting word, because a sign is something that points away from itself to some other reality. And in the Gospel of John, what Jesus does, those acts, are the signs that point to who he is. And so often in the Gospel of John, the signs of Jesus point to him as the one who brings life from God. So in chapter 4, you have the story of the healing of the royal official's son. And this man comes to Jesus and says, my son is dying. And Jesus says to him, your son will live. And he does. Jesus is the one who gives life. In John chapter 6, there are 5,000 people in a deserted place, and they are hungry. And Jesus feeds them with bread and fish. And what does that sign point to? What does that tell us? What does that show? Just what Jesus says later, I am the bread of life. So the one who feeds with bread is the one who is the bread of life. In John chapter 10, Jesus uses the image of being a good shepherd. I am the good shepherd, and I protect my sheep from wolves and from everything that wants to destroy and kill them. Because not only am I the one who gives life, but I protect them, I keep them in life. In John 11, we have the story of the raising of Lazarus, a friend of Jesus who has died. And Jesus goes to his tomb and calls him forth because he is the resurrection and the life. Not only do the things that Jesus does show us that he is the life from God, but the words that he speaks are also the words of life. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the door for the sheep. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. You are the branches. Notice every one of these images is about life. Bread that feeds, the resurrection that raises to life, a vine that gives life to the branches, a shepherd who protects his sheep. And this is what I think Jesus wants us to know. He wants us to know this one thing about God, that God is the God of all life, and that he comes from the God of all life, and that what he does as the will of God is to bring life to the world in his deed and in his word. Another one of the emphases of the Gospel of John that runs throughout, I think, the whole gospel is that this is a story about Jesus for all times and places. So yes, it's narrating a man who once lived, who walked about in Galilee and Judea and did a lot of things back then. But this is what John wants to say. What he came to give and to do for people back then is what he gives and does for people now. What he once did in the past is what he still does for people today. There are two other stories in the Gospel of John I want to call our attention to in that regard. And one is one of the resurrection appearances that comes in the 21st chapter, the last chapter of the Gospel of John. There, Jesus appears to 5 of his disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They have gone fishing. They aren't having any luck, but they're out in a boat on the sea, toiling away, and someone from the shore, at this point they don't know who it is, someone from the shore says, "Have you caught anything?" And they say, "No." And he says, "Well, throw your net on the other side." And when they do, they find that their net is bursting with large fish. In fact, the Gospel of John tells us 153 large fish. They haul their nets into shore. They get that little boat up on the shore. And what do they see there? Jesus is cooking breakfast for them. So just as he fed 5,000 people in a deserted place back in the middle of his ministry, so now after his death, he has not stopped feeding his disciples. And I think what John wants to say to us, look at that. What he did back then, he did for his disciples, and he's still doing for us today. The risen Lord still feeds his people. So if we can back up a chapter from chapter 21 to chapter 20, we have a resurrection appearance that's pretty well known to Thomas. And the story goes like this. The disciples are alone or are in a room, and Thomas isn't with them. And Jesus appears to them and makes himself known. And then when they meet up with Thomas, they say, "Guess what? We have seen the Lord." Now, you might think Thomas would say, "Wow, that's really great." But instead, he's skeptical. How do I know you've seen the Lord? And why don't I get to see him? Unless I can see what you saw, I can't believe what you believe. And then the next time Jesus appears, Thomas is with them, and Thomas gets to see with his own eyes Jesus standing right in front of him. And he says, as is probably well known from the Gospel of John, "My Lord and my God," recognizing who Jesus is. And Jesus says this to Thomas, "You have believed because you have seen. But blessed are those who have not seen and still believe." And then John goes on to write this. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. And so one of the things I think John is telling the readers of the gospel, just because you never saw Jesus, because you didn't walk the land with him, you are not a second-hand disciple. You are not a second-best disciple, because the Jesus who was is the Jesus who is, and what he gave is what he gives. And he gave life and he gives life. And this gospel tells the stories to you in such a way so that you can read what he did, what he said, what he promised, and know that this is who he still is for us today. When you read the gospel and you see all that he gave to people, healing and feeding and love and fellowship and community in the Spirit, remember that these are gifts that he still gives. And that above all, the gift that he gives is the gift of himself, which is the gift of God's life to us.